The floorboards creak somewhere above her head, and Sarah jolts awake in the darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs. For a moment, she cannot remember where she is. The unfamiliar room swims into focus as her eyes adjust, the antique furniture casting strange shadows in the moonlight, filtering through lace curtains. Then she remembers. She is sleeping in the guest room of the Lizzie Borden bed and breakfast in Fall River, Massachusetts. She is lying in the very house where one of America's most brutal unsolved murders took place over 130 years ago. That is when she hears it. The sound that woke her. A woman is weeping. The crying is soft at first, muffled, as though coming from behind closed doors or perhaps from another floor entirely. Sarah sits up slowly, pulling the covers close around her shoulders despite the summer warmth. The weeping grows louder, more distinct. It is the sound of deep, inconsolable grief, the kind of sobbing that comes from a place of absolute despair. The sound seems to move through the walls themselves, drifting closer and then receding, as if the weeping woman is pacing the hallways of this Victorian mansion, searching for something she will never find. Sarah is not alone in hearing these sounds. Guests at this infamous bed and breakfast have reported the phantom weeping for decades. Some hear footsteps on the back staircase in the dead hours between midnight and dawn. Others wake to the sensation of unseen hands, touching their faces or pulling at their blankets. Shadow figures glide through doorways. Objects move on their own. Cold spots manifest in rooms where the August murders occurred. This house, with its elegant gables and period furnishings, has become one of America's most actively haunted locations, drawing paranormal investigators and curious visitors from around the world who seek encounters with whatever remains trapped within these walls. But what exactly lingers here? And why has this particular house become such a nexus of supernatural activity? To understand the haunting, we must first understand the horror that birthed it. On the morning of August 4th, 1892, this respectable Victorian home became the scene of carnage that would shock the nation and create a mystery that remains unsolved to this day. Andrew Borden and his wife Abby were brutally murdered with an axe, their skulls crushed with such savage force that investigators would later struggle to comprehend the rage required to inflict such devastating wounds. The killer struck in broad daylight, in a house occupied by family members and a maid, yet somehow moved through the rooms like a phantom, leaving behind 2 mutilated bodies and almost no physical evidence. The prime suspect was Andrew's 32-year-old daughter, Lizzie, who became the focal point of a sensational trial that captivated the country. A Sunday school teacher from a prominent family, accused of parricide. The Victorian mind could scarcely conceive of such a thing. Lizzie was ultimately acquitted, but the court of public opinion has tried and retried her case for more than a century. Did she commit these terrible acts? Or was she an innocent woman destroyed by suspicion and scandal? The question has never been definitively answered, and perhaps that uncertainty is part of what keeps the spirits here restless, trapped in an endless cycle of violence and accusation from which there can be no escape. This is where our investigation truly begins. We stand at the intersection of true crime and the supernatural, where documented historical tragedy meets unexplained phenomena that defy rational explanation. Over the coming journey, we will walk through every moment of that terrible August morning, examining the crime scene, the suspects, the evidence, and the glaring inconsistencies that have kept this case alive in the American imagination. But we will also venture into darker territory, exploring the relentless paranormal activity that has transformed this house into something more than a historical curiosity. Are the spirits said to haunt this place the victims themselves, unable to rest until justice is finally served? Or is something far more sinister at work here, something that fed on the violence of that day and has remained ever since, drawing strength from the fear and fascination of all who enter? These are the questions that will guide us through both the forensic details and the phantom encounters, through courtroom testimony and seance transcripts, through rational investigation and inexplicable terror. The woman in the darkness has stopped weeping now. Sarah sits alone in her guest room, listening to the profound silence that has fallen over the house. Somehow, the silence feels worse than the crying. It feels like the stillness before a storm, the held breath before a scream. Tomorrow, she will check out early, cutting short her paranormal adventure. But tonight, she lies awake until dawn, watching the shadows, wondering who or what was weeping in the halls of the Lizzie Borden house, and whether the dead can ever truly find peace in a place where such violence occurred. The answers we seek lie hidden in the past, in the blood-soaked rooms of that August morning, in the faces of the family members who may have harbored terrible secrets, and perhaps in the whispers of spirits who have never left. Welcome to the Lizzie Borden house, where history and haunting have become impossibly intertwined, where the line between the living and the dead grows thin, and where the truth remains as elusive as the phantom footsteps echoing through the night. The morning of August 4th, 1892, dawned hot and humid in Fall River, Massachusetts. The air hung thick and still, one of those oppressive New England summer days where heat seemed to press down from above and rise up from the pavement below. Inside the house at 92 2nd Street, the Borden family moved through their morning rituals in characteristic silence, navigating around each other like strangers sharing a boarding house rather than blood relatives under one roof. The household had taken breakfast separately that morning, as they often did. Andrew Jackson Borden, 70 years old and one of the wealthiest men in Fall River, ate early. His wife, Abby Durfee Gray Borden, 64 years old and tolerated rather than loved by her stepdaughters, took her meal alone. Lizzie Andrew Borden, 32 years old and unmarried, remained upstairs in her room. Her older sister Emma was away, visiting friends in Fairhaven, 15 miles distant. The Irish maid, Bridget Sullivan, whom the family called Maggie for reasons lost to time, prepared the food and cleaned up afterward, moving through rooms that felt more like a museum than a home. This was not a house of warmth. Despite Andrew Borden's considerable fortune, estimated at nearly $500,000, a staggering sum for that era, the family lived with an austere frugality that bordered on miserliness. No indoor plumbing graced the premises. No gas lighting illuminated the dark corners. The family used oil lamps and carried chamber pots, living like people of modest means while Andrew's bank account swelled. He owned rental properties throughout Fall River, held positions on the boards of multiple banks, and conducted business dealings that had made him rich beyond the dreams of his mill-working neighbors. Yet in his own home, comfort was rationed like a scarce commodity. The tensions within this household ran deep, carved into the very foundation by years of resentment and barely concealed hostility. Lizzie and Emma had never accepted their stepmother, refusing to call her mother even after decades of marriage to their father. They addressed her as Mrs. Borden, if they addressed her at all. The conflict had intensified 5 years earlier when Andrew had transferred property to Abby's sister, a move the daughters viewed as theft of their rightful inheritance. Though Andrew had attempted to smooth things over by giving the sisters rental property of their own, the wound had festered. The family had stopped eating meals together. They locked their bedroom doors at night. They communicated through cold silences and bitter glances. That morning, Andrew left the house around 9 o'clock to make his rounds in town, visiting his bank, checking on properties, conducting the business that consumed his days. Abby, meanwhile, set about her domestic tasks upstairs in the guest bedroom, the room directly above the sitting room, where later everything would change. She was making the bed, tucking sheets with the methodical care of a woman accustomed to doing such work herself, despite having a maid in the house. Sometime between 9 and half past the hour, while Abby Borden bent over the guest bed smoothing linens, someone entered that room behind her. What happened next lasted only minutes, but would echo through more than a century of American crime history. The attacker raised an axe or hatchet and brought it down on Abby's head with devastating force. The first blow likely killed her or rendered her unconscious, but the attack did not stop. Again and again, the blade fell. 19 times in total, the weapon crashed into her skull, obliterating her face, turning the back of her head into a mass of splintered bone and torn flesh. Blood spattered the walls. It soaked into the floorboards. Abby fell forward across the bed she had been making, her body positioned between the bed and the bureau, one arm extended as if reaching for something she would never grasp. The violence was extraordinary, excessive beyond any practical need. This was not merely killing. This was obliteration, an attempt to erase, to destroy utterly. The sheer number of blows suggested rage or frenzy, a loss of control that turned a human being into a butcher and another human being into meat. And then, with Abby lying dead in a spreading pool of blood, the killer left the room. The house fell silent again. The heat pressed down. Time passed. 90 minutes. That is the gap that forensic analysis would later establish. 90 minutes during which Abby's body cooled and her blood congealed upstairs while the rest of the household moved about below, unaware or feigning ignorance. The medical examiner would later determine, based on the state of the body and the digestion of stomach contents, that Abby had died substantially before her husband. 90 minutes is an eternity. It is long enough for blood to dry at the edges, for a body to lose its warmth, for a killer to clean themselves, to hide a weapon, to construct a story. Andrew Borden returned home shortly before 10:30 that morning. He had been out for approximately 90 minutes, the same span of time his wife had lain murdered upstairs. He tried his key in the front door but found it locked from the inside with multiple locks, unusual even for this security-conscious household. Bridget Sullivan came to let him in, struggling with the stubborn locks and muttering under her breath. As she wrestled with the door, she heard laughter from somewhere above her on the stairs. Light, incongruous laughter in that silent house. Andrew entered and moved through to the sitting room, a small parlor at the rear of the first floor. He was not feeling well. The heat oppressed him, and his 70 years weighed heavy that morning. He removed his jacket. He lay down on the horsehair sofa to rest, his head on a small pillow, his feet not quite reaching the other end. Perhaps he closed his eyes. Perhaps he saw his killer approach. We will never know if there was a moment of recognition, a second of understanding before the end came. The attack was swift and brutal. The first blow likely came as Andrew lay on the sofa, possibly asleep, possibly in that drowsy state between waking and sleeping. The hatchet, for the medical examiner would later determine that a hatchet was the most likely weapon, came down on his face. Not the back of his head, as with Abby, but his face. 11 blows in rapid succession, each one landing above the neck, crushing the skull, destroying the eye socket, cleaving through bone and brain. One blow cut his eyeball cleanly in half. Another removed his nose. The left side of his face was sheared away, leaving an unrecognizable ruin where a man's features had been moments before. The violence was focused, controlled compared to the attack on Abby, yet no less horrifying. 11 blows, all to the head, all landing true. This was not wild swinging, but deliberate destruction of a specific target. Blood and tissue sprayed across the wall behind the sofa. It dripped onto Andrew's collar and shirt. A piece of his skull would later be found on the floor. The man who had counted his pennies and accumulated his fortune lay dead in his own sitting room, murdered with the same weapon that had killed his wife 90 minutes earlier. The timeline matters because it reveals premeditation. This was not a sudden explosion of violence that claimed 2 victims in quick succession. The killer struck once, waited, and struck again. They moved through the house with purpose, patient, and calculating. They allowed Andrew to return home, to settle himself, to recline on the sofa before ending his life. What did they do during those 90 minutes? Where did they wait? Lizzie Borden claimed she was in the barn loft looking for sinkers for a fishing trip when her father was murdered. She said she spent 20 minutes or more in that stifling loft, one of the hottest places on the property on one of the hottest days of the year, searching for lead weights for a fishing expedition she had not planned with any specific person. When she returned to the house, she said she discovered her father's body and called for Bridget. Her composure in that moment struck witnesses as unusual. She did not scream. She did not cry out in horror. She called for the maid in a voice that one neighbor later described as flat, emotionless, as if reporting a broken dish rather than a butchered father. The police arrived to a scene of methodical carnage. 2 bodies, one upstairs and one down, both killed with similar weapons and similar fury. The house showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared to have been stolen. Andrew's watch and wallet remained untouched. This was not robbery. This was personal. Lizzie's behavior in the hours and days following the murders raised immediate suspicion. Her stories changed. First she said she was in the kitchen when her father came home. Then she said she was upstairs. Then the barn. She claimed she heard nothing, saw nothing, despite being in the house or on the property when both murders occurred. When asked about the dress she wore that day, she gave conflicting descriptions. 3 days after the murders, witnesses saw her burning a dress in the kitchen stove, claiming it was paint stain. In a house where Andrew Borden counted every penny, where waste was treated as sin, Lizzie chose to burn a dress rather than clean it. The forensic evidence told its own story. The killer would have been covered in blood. The arterial spray, the impact spatter, the sheer volume of blood from 19 blows to one victim, and 11 to another meant that whoever wielded that hatchet had to have been drenched. Yet Lizzie appeared clean when the police arrived less than an hour after Andrew's death. Her dress showed no blood. Her hands were unstained. Either she had cleaned herself with remarkable efficiency, or someone else had committed these murders and vanished like smoke. The weapon was never definitively found. Police discovered a hatchet head in the basement, its handle freshly broken off, and the break covered in ashes as if someone had tried to burn it. But the blade showed no traces of blood, and expert testimony would later question whether this was the murder weapon at all. The Borden household had been a pressure cooker of resentment, financial tension, and barely suppressed rage. Lizzie and Emma believed their father favored Abby's family over his own daughters. They watched their inheritance being given away to relatives of a woman they despised. They lived in unnecessary poverty while their father's wealth accumulated. The will had not yet been written. If Andrew died before drafting his final testament, his daughters would inherit everything. On the morning of August 4, 1892, someone took an axe to the Borden family tree and cut it down at the root. The crime scene was confined, intimate, domestic. The violence was extreme, personal, and methodical. And at the center of it all stood Lizzie Andrew Borden, her alibis shifting like sand, her demeanor unsettlingly calm, her hands clean while her parents lay butchered in their own home. The courtroom in New Bedford, Massachusetts, fell silent on the morning of June 5, 1893, as Lizzie Andrew Borden rose to face the jury of her peers. 12 men, all property owners, all respectable members of Victorian society, held her fate in their hands. For 13 days, they had listened to testimony that painted a portrait of murder so brutal, so savage, that newspapers across the nation struggled to describe it without offending their readers' sensibility. Andrew Borden had received 11 blows to the head with a hatchet. His wife Abby had suffered 18. The violence spoke of rage, of something primal and uncontrolled. And yet the woman accused of wielding that weapon stood before them in a dress of black silk, her demeanor composed, her bearing that of a respectable spinster from one of Fall River's most prominent families. The evidence against Lizzie should have been damning. She had been in the house when both murders occurred, claiming to be in the barn loft looking for fishing sinkers during the exact window when her stepmother was killed. The police would later find the loft floor covered in undisturbed dust, no footprints marking where she claimed to have walked. She discovered her father's body herself, calling to the maid Bridget Sullivan with a strange calmness that several witnesses found deeply unsettling. When asked where she had been, her answers shifted like sand. First the barn, then perhaps the yard. Maybe she had been eating a pear, or was it in the kitchen ironing handkerchiefs? Each retelling brought new details, contradicted old ones, created a web of inconsistency that the prosecution seized upon with growing confidence. The timeline itself trapped her in a cage of her own making. Abby Borden was killed sometime between 9 and 10:30 in the morning, struck down in the upstairs guest bedroom while making the bed. She fell face down, her blood soaking into the carpet, her skull shattered by repeated blows that continued even after death had claimed her. Lizzie claimed to have been downstairs during this time, yet she heard nothing. No struggle, no cry, no sound of a body falling to the floor above her head. Andrew Borden returned home at approximately 10:45, lay down on the sofa in the sitting room for his customary nap, and was killed within minutes. Lizzie was, by her own admission, the only other person in the house besides the maid Bridget, who had been resting in her attic room after completing her morning chores. The murder weapon was never definitively found, though police discovered a handleless hatchet head in the basement, freshly broken and covered in ash as if someone had attempted to conceal it by rubbing it in the furnace. This hatchet was clean of blood, but forensic science in 1892 was primitive at best. Prosecutors argued that the killer would have had time to wash the weapon, perhaps burning the wooden handle to eliminate evidence. They pointed to Lizzie's actions in the days following the murders. She had burned a dress in the kitchen stove, claiming it was stained with paint and therefore useless. This occurred 3 days after the killings, with a police officer present in the house and investigation in full swing. When questioned about this peculiar timing, Lizzie maintained her innocence with the same calm detachment she had shown since the discovery of the bodies. Her testimony during the inquest revealed even more troubling contradictions. She claimed her father had enemies, business rivals who might wish him harm, but could name none specifically. She suggested a mysterious stranger might have entered the house, though all doors were locked, and no signs of forced entry existed. She stated that her relationship with her stepmother was cordial, despite neighbors testifying to years of barely concealed hostility. The Borden household, they said, was a place of cold silence, where Lizzie and her sister Emma referred to their stepmother as Mrs. Borden rather than mother, where meals were taken in shifts to avoid family interaction, where Andrew's legendary miserliness created constant friction. The prosecution built their case on motive as well as opportunity. Andrew Borden, worth nearly $500,000, a staggering fortune for 1892, had recently transferred property to Abby's relatives. Lizzie, who had enjoyed her father's favor, saw this as a betrayal. She feared that her inheritance, her security, her social standing were all being diminished to benefit a woman she despised. On the morning of the murders, Lizzie had attempted to purchase prussic acid from a local pharmacy, claiming she needed it to clean a sealskin cape. The pharmacist refused the sale, finding the request suspicious. This occurred less than 24 hours before her father and stepmother were killed. Yet for all this evidence, for all these contradictions and suspicious behaviors, the jury deliberated for less than 90 minutes before returning a verdict of not guilty. Victorian sensibilities simply could not accommodate the image of a genteel woman, a Sunday school teacher, a member of the Congregational Church, committing such unspeakable violence. The defense had argued brilliantly that Lizzie's femininity itself was proof of innocence. How could hands that arranged flowers and embroidered pillowcases wield a hatchet with such savage fury? How could a woman of refinement and education harbor the kind of rage necessary to strike her stepmother 18 times, to continue raining blows upon a body already lifeless? The all-male jury, products of their time and class, found it easier to believe in phantom intruders and impossible scenarios than to accept that a woman of their own social sphere could be capable of matricide and parricide. The prosecution's case, though strong on circumstantial evidence, lacked the one element Victorian justice seemed to require: an eyewitness or a confession. Without someone who had seen the act itself, without Lizzie's own admission of guilt, reasonable doubt could flourish in the soil of gender prejudice and class solidarity. The courtroom erupted in applause when the verdict was read. Lizzie, maintaining the composure that had characterized her throughout the trial, showed neither relief nor triumph. She simply nodded, gathered her things, and prepared to return to Fall River. She could not have known then that her acquittal, rather than restoring her place in society, would mark the beginning of a different kind of imprisonment. Fall River turned against her with a coldness that rivaled the violence of the murders themselves. Shops that had once welcomed her custom now found reasons to be closed when she approached. Invitations to social gatherings ceased entirely. Former friends crossed the street rather than acknowledge her presence. The Congregational Church, where she had taught children about morality and righteousness, quietly suggested her attendance was no longer appropriate. The verdict of the court meant nothing to the verdict of society. 12 men might have found her innocent, but the people of Fall River had tried her in their own way and reached a different conclusion. Lizzie responded by purchasing a house on the hill, in the fashionable neighborhood her father's wealth should have granted her access to years before. She named it Maplecroft, a grand Victorian mansion that spoke of affluence and refinement. There she lived with her sister Emma for several years, employing servants, hosting occasional gatherings for the few who would associate with her, and maintaining the fiction that she was simply another wealthy spinster living out her days in comfort. But the walls of Maplecroft could not keep out the whispers, and even Emma eventually left, the sisters estranged by tensions that neither would publicly discuss. For 35 years, Lizzie lived in that house, growing increasingly isolated as the decades passed. She developed interests that Fall River found scandalous: a friendship with an actress, lavish parties that neighbors complained were too loud and too late, behavior that seemed to flaunt her freedom rather than demonstrate the humility of the wrongly accused. She never married, never left Fall River permanently, and never publicly addressed the murders again. When reporters came calling, seeking interviews on anniversaries of the crime, she turned them away. When theories proliferated in newspapers and magazines, she remained silent. The theories multiplied in that silence. Some believed she was guilty but had been aided by an accomplice, perhaps the maid Bridget Sullivan, who left Fall River shortly after the trial and never returned. Others suggested her uncle John Morse, who had been visiting the house that week and whose own timeline placed him conveniently elsewhere during the murders. A few pointed to an illegitimate son of Andrew Borden, a secret child who might have sought revenge for years of abandonment. Each theory found adherents, each had its logical appeals, but none could be proven. Some modern researchers have suggested Lizzie suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, which can cause fugue states and violent behavior that the sufferer cannot recall. Others point to years of potential abuse, emotional if not physical, that might have created a breaking point. Still others maintain her innocence absolutely, arguing that the real killer escaped justice while Lizzie became a convenient scapegoat for a community eager to solve an unsolvable crime. Lizzie died on June 1st, 1927, in her bedroom at Maplecroft. She was 66 years old. Her sister Emma had died just days before, though they had not spoken in years. Lizzie was buried in the family plot at Oak Grove Cemetery, joining the father and stepmother she may or may not have killed. Her will distributed her considerable estate to various charities and servants, a final gesture of the gentility she had maintained despite society's rejection. But she left no confession, no letter of explanation, no deathbed revelation that might have finally answered the question that had haunted Fall River for 35 years. The Borden House on 2nd Street, where the murders occurred, stood as a monument to unresolved justice. Later owners would report strange occurrences: footsteps on the stairs when no one was climbing them, the sound of a woman weeping in the guest bedroom where Abby died, a sense of oppressive dread in the sitting room where Andrew was killed. Skeptics dismissed such claims as imagination fueled by the house's notorious history, but others wondered if violence of such magnitude could imprint itself on a place, if the question mark that hung over the murders had created a kind of spiritual restlessness that refused to dissipate. The case remains officially unsolved, though most historians believe Lizzie was guilty. The evidence of opportunity, motive, and her own contradictory statements creates a portrait of guilt that legal acquittal cannot erase. Yet without certainty, without that final piece of proof, the murders exist in a liminal space between known and unknown, resolved and unresolved. This ambiguity, this refusal to settle into comfortable certainty, may be the truest haunting of all. Not ghosts in the conventional sense, but the persistent presence of questions that can never be answered, secrets that died with Lizzie Borden and remain buried still. The guest room at the Lizzie Borden house sits on the 2nd floor, bathed in shadows even during the brightest hours of the day. It is a place where history and horror converge, where the floorboards remember the weight of Abigail Borden as she knelt beside the bed on that sweltering August morning in 1892, straightening the bedskirt moments before the first blow fell. These walls absorbed her final breath, the whisper of fabric as she collapsed, the terrible silence that followed. But if you ask those who have spent the night in this room, they will tell you the silence never lasts. Between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning, when the world outside holds its breath, and even Fall River sleeps, something stirs within these four walls. A sound emerges from the darkness, soft at first, barely distinguishable from the creaking of the old house settling on its foundation. Then it grows clearer, unmistakable, undeniable. The sound of a woman weeping. Jennifer Martinez first heard the sobbing on a cold November night in 2008. A teacher from Providence, Rhode Island, she had always been fascinated by true crime, but considered herself firmly grounded in rational thinking. She had specifically requested Abby's room when booking her overnight stay at the bed and breakfast, eager to experience the location where one of Fall River's most infamous murders had occurred. Jennifer arrived with a friend, both women armed with cameras and voice recorders, treating the experience as an adventure, almost a lark. They settled into the room as the sun descended, noting the antique furniture, the reproduction wallpaper, the iron bed frame that stood approximately where Abby had fallen. Jennifer's friend chose to sleep in the connecting John Morse guest room, leaving Jennifer alone in the space where Abigail Borden had drawn her last breath. The first hours passed uneventfully. Jennifer read by lamplight, scrolled through her phone, and finally switched off the bedside lamp at around midnight. Sleep came easily at first, but something pulled her back to consciousness at precisely 2:17 in the morning. She knew the exact time because she checked her phone, thinking perhaps an alarm had sounded. The room was absolutely still, dark except for the faint glow of streetlights filtering through the lace curtains. Then she heard it. A soft, rhythmic sound, like someone struggling to catch their breath between tears. The sobbing seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, not localized to any specific corner of the room, but rather emanating from the walls themselves, from the very air around her. Jennifer's rational mind immediately began cataloging possible explanations. Perhaps a guest in another room was upset. Maybe the old heating system was creating an unusual sound as it cycled through the pipes. But as she lay there, paralyzed beneath the heavy quilt, the weeping continued with a consistency that defied these simple explanations. It was not the sound of pipes expanding and contracting. It was distinctly, unmistakably human. More than that, it carried a quality of such profound grief that Jennifer found tears forming in her own eyes, though she could not explain why. The sadness in that crying seemed bottomless, ancient, trapped in an eternal loop of suffering. She reached for her voice recorder, hands shaking as she fumbled with the buttons in the darkness, and managed to capture nearly 7 minutes of audio before the sobbing gradually faded away, diminishing like a radio being slowly turned down until only silence remained. When morning light finally crept through the windows, Jennifer found her friend already awake in the next room, pale and clearly shaken. Before Jennifer could speak, her friend asked a single question. "Did you hear someone crying last night?" Neither woman had mentioned the possibility of paranormal activity before going to sleep. Neither had primed the other to expect unusual sounds. Yet both had heard the same phenomenon, the unmistakable sound of a woman in deep distress, weeping as though her heart would break. David Chen, a software engineer from San Francisco, had a similar experience 3 years later in 2011. A self-described skeptic who enjoyed debunking ghost stories, David deliberately chose to stay in Abby's room as part of what he called a personal experiment in critical thinking. He came equipped with scientific instruments including multiple audio recording devices, a thermal imaging camera, and even an electromagnetic field detector. David treated the entire endeavor as an opportunity to demonstrate how easily the human mind can be fooled by creaking floors and settling foundations in old houses. He spent the evening thoroughly documenting the room, recording baseline readings of temperature and electromagnetic activity, making note of every natural sound the building produced as guests moved about and prepared for sleep. At 2:43 in the morning, David was awakened by a sound he later described as utterly unlike anything he had ever heard. The weeping started quietly, almost as if someone was trying to muffle their sobs, pressing a hand or cloth against their mouth to contain the sound. It built slowly, growing in intensity and volume until David sat bolt upright in bed, completely convinced that another person was in the room with him. He switched on his flashlight, sweeping the beam across every corner, under the bed, into the closet. The room was empty. Yet the crying continued, so clear and present that David could hear the intake of breath between sobs, the slight catch in the throat, the wet sound of tears. His recording devices captured everything. What David discovered when he reviewed the audio the next day unsettled him far more than the experience itself. The weeping was there on every recorder, crystal clear and undeniable. But when he ran the files through audio analysis software, something strange emerged in the frequency spectrum. The sobbing contained tones and harmonics that fell outside the normal range of human vocal production. There were frequencies too low for the average person to consciously hear, subsonic waves that might explain the sensation of pressure in the chest that David had felt while listening. There were also ultrasonic components, pitches above the threshold of human hearing, yet somehow present in what sounded like a woman's voice. David sent the files to an acoustics professor at the university, where he had completed his undergraduate degree, asking for a professional analysis without revealing the source of the recording. The professor's response came 2 weeks later. The audio was genuine, not fabricated or artificially manipulated. But the frequency analysis was inconsistent with recordings of living human voices. The harmonics were wrong, the professor explained. When we speak or cry, our vocal cords and resonating chambers create predictable patterns of frequencies. These patterns were present in the recording, but distorted, stretched, as if the sound had been passed through some filter that no longer existed in the physical world. The professor could offer no conventional explanation. David, true to his skeptical nature, refused to label the experience as proof of the supernatural, but he never again claimed that ghost stories could be easily explained away. Something had cried in that room, and whatever it was, it existed in a state that defied normal acoustic physics. The pattern repeats itself with remarkable consistency. Overnight guests staying in Abby's room report hearing the sobbing between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning. Always the same mournful weeping. Always carrying that unbearable weight of grief. Sarah Thompson, a nurse from Boston, heard it in 2015. Marcus and Diane Rodriguez, a couple celebrating their anniversary, both woke to the sound in 2018. A group of college students on a spring break ghost tour heard it in 2020, weeks before the pandemic forced the house to temporarily close to overnight guests. The witnesses come from different backgrounds, different levels of belief in the paranormal, different expectations about what they might experience. Yet their descriptions remain strikingly similar. A woman crying in absolute despair. The sound seemingly embedded in the room itself, present but not quite physical, audible but originating from somewhere beyond normal perception. Those who stay in Abby's room often report more than just auditory phenomena. There is a psychological weight to the space, a heaviness that settles over the room as darkness falls. Guests describe an overwhelming sensation of sadness that seems to come from outside themselves, an emotional atmosphere so dense it becomes almost physical. Some report difficulty breathing, as if the air itself has grown thick with sorrow. The feeling of being watched is nearly universal among those who spend the night there, a prickling awareness of unseen eyes, a presence that observes without revealing itself. Several guests have cut their stays short, unable to endure the oppressive emotional environment, the sense that they are intruding on private grief, witnessing something too intimate and terrible to bear. Paranormal investigators who have studied the Lizzie Borden house extensively have developed a theory about why Abby's room remains such an active location. They suggest that Abigail Borden's spirit is trapped in a loop, endlessly reliving the moments before her death. On that August morning in 1892, Abby had no reason to fear for her life as she knelt beside the guest room bed, tidying the space as she had done countless times before. She did not hear the footsteps approaching from behind. She did not see the axe raised above her head. Her death came suddenly, violently, from someone she had welcomed into her home, someone she had fed and sheltered and tried to love despite the constant friction that simmered beneath the surface of their household. The betrayal was absolute, the shock so profound that perhaps some essential part of Abigail Borden could not process what had happened. Instead of moving forward, passing through whatever doorway awaits the dead, she remains frozen in those final moments, caught between the peace of an ordinary morning and the horror of unthinkable violence. The weeping, according to this theory, is not just grief over her own death, but the deeper anguish of betrayal. Whether or not Abby knew in her final seconds that Lizzie stood behind her with the axe, her spirit seems bound by the emotional truth of what happened. Someone she had known, someone who lived under her roof, had ended her life with brutal efficiency. The trust that forms the foundation of family, of home, of safety itself, had been shattered along with her skull. That kind of psychic wound, investigators suggest, might not heal even in death. It might echo endlessly through time, manifesting as the sound of inconsolable weeping in the early morning hours, when the boundary between past and present grows thin. The sobbing in Abby's room continues to this day. The current owners of the bed and breakfast neither encourage nor discourage discussion of the phenomenon. They simply note that many guests report unusual experiences, and they keep a log of documented incidents. The recordings pile up, dozens of audio files capturing those same heartbroken sobs, that same impossible grief. Analysis continues to show those strange frequency anomalies, those harmonics that should not exist in a human voice. Scientists and skeptics offer theories about infrasound, about the psychological power of suggestion, about how old houses create acoustic illusions. But none of these explanations fully account for the consistency of the reports, the emotional impact on witnesses, or the undeniable presence of something that defies easy categorization. Perhaps what makes Abby's room so disturbing is not just the weeping itself, but what it represents. It speaks to our deepest fears about the permanence of suffering, the possibility that trauma might echo beyond death, that some wounds cut so deep they cannot heal even when the body is long gone. The woman who cries in that room, whoever or whatever she might be, remains locked in a moment of absolute betrayal, unable to move forward, unable to find peace. And those who hear her weeping carry away the knowledge that some sorrows transcend time itself, reverberating through the decades like a voice calling from the bottom of a very deep, very dark well. The bedroom on the second floor of the Borden house carries a peculiar stillness, the kind that makes visitors pause in the doorway before entering. It was Lizzie's private domain once, the place where she slept, dressed, and perhaps planned the events of that sweltering August morning in 1892. Today, the room maintains much of its original appearance, furnished with period-appropriate pieces and several items that actually belonged to the Borden family. Among these authentic possessions, one object commands unusual attention from both staff and visitors. It stands near the window, a silent sentinel that has become the focus of some of the most compelling paranormal reports in the entire house. The antique dress form rises from the floorboards like a headless specter, its wire frame and faded fabric creating the suggestion of a woman's torso without the completion of human features. Museum staff positioned it there decades ago, a simple display piece meant to evoke the Victorian era. But this particular dress form refuses to remain a passive artifact. Security guards making their rounds report finding it rotated from its original position, sometimes 45 degrees, sometimes facing an entirely different direction than where they last saw it. The movement follows no predictable pattern, occurring during the night when the building sits locked and empty, or sometimes between tour groups when the room stands vacant for mere minutes. What makes the dress form truly unsettling is the specificity of witness accounts. Visitors describe entering the room to find the form directly facing the doorway, as though it had been waiting for someone to arrive. A volunteer docent named Margaret Chen documented her experiences over the course of 3 years working at the house. She began photographing the dress form at the start and end of each shift, creating a visual record that showed the object in different orientations without any staff member touching it. On 17 separate occasions, she arrived for the morning shift to find the form turned completely around from its position the previous evening. The building security system showed no intrusions, no unauthorized entries, nothing that could explain the movement. Other staff members started noticing a pattern. The dress form seemed to rotate toward whoever entered the room first. A maintenance worker reported walking in to check a window latch and feeling immediate unease when he realized the form was oriented directly at him, despite having seen it facing the opposite wall just hours before. Tour guides began testing this phenomenon, deliberately noting the form's position before stepping out, then watching as the next person to enter would comment on feeling watched. The dress form, they realized, wasn't moving randomly. It was tracking people. The photographs that accumulate at the Borden house tell their own disturbing story. Visitors snap thousands of pictures each year, capturing the rooms, the furnishings, the blood-stained patterns carefully preserved beneath the floorboard. But certain images reveal elements invisible to the naked eye at the moment of capture. Shadow figures appear in digital files, dark feminine shapes that stand in doorways or linger at the edges of frames. The silhouettes consistently show the same characteristics. A woman's form, a Victorian-era dress with a high collar and long skirts, sometimes a suggestion of hair piled atop the head in the style of the 1890s. These shadow figures concentrate in specific locations. The main staircase produces the highest number of anomalous images, with dozens of photographs showing a dark feminine shape on the steps. She appears to be descending, always descending, caught in an eternal journey from the second floor to the first. The silhouette never shows facial features, never reveals enough detail to identify which woman might be manifesting. But the dress, the posture, the deliberate movement down those stairs toward the sitting room, where Andrew Borden died, creates an unavoidable association. One photograph in particular circulates among paranormal investigators who study the Borden case. A tourist captured it on an ordinary afternoon in 2008, a simple shot meant to document the staircase. In the developed image, a shadow figure occupies the middle steps, so clearly defined that you can see the outline of sleeves, the drape of a long skirt, even the suggestion of hands gripping the banister. The photographer insists the stairs were empty when she took the picture. 3 other visitors in the room at that moment corroborate her account. Yet, there it stands, preserved in digital pixels, a woman who shouldn't exist making her way down the Borden stairs. The night shift caretaker position at the house experiences high turnover, a fact the administration attributes to the demanding hours and isolated nature of the work. But former employees tell a different story. Marcus Thompson worked the overnight shift for 8 months in 2015, performing security checks and maintaining the building during its closed hours. His encounter on a March evening ended his employment and left him reluctant to discuss the house in anything but the most general terms. According to his account, provided to a local paranormal research team, Thompson was conducting his standard walkthrough around 2 o'clock in the morning. The building was locked, the alarm system armed at all entry points, the cameras showing no movement. He stood in the first-floor hallway, checking doors, when he heard footsteps on the staircase. Not the settling sounds of an old house, not the creaks of aging wood, but deliberate footfalls, the sound of someone descending the stairs with purpose. Thompson turned toward the staircase and saw her. A woman in a long Victorian dress, her features visible in the dim emergency lighting, her hand trailing along the banister. She moved down the steps with complete solidity, no transparency, no ethereal glow, just a woman descending the stairs where no woman should be. He described her dress as dark, perhaps green or brown, high-necked and formal. Her hair was pulled back severely from her face. Her expression, he said, was one of intense concentration, as though she was focused on reaching the bottom of the stairs, on completing some essential task. Thompson called out, asking who she was and how she'd gotten inside. The woman's head turned toward him, her eyes meeting his directly. He describes those eyes as aware and intelligent, filled with something he interpreted as anger or fierce determination. The moment he acknowledged her presence directly, spoke to her as though she were a living person in the building, she vanished. Not faded, not walked away, but simply ceased to exist between one breath and the next. Thompson checked every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. The security footage showed him standing alone in that hallway, speaking to empty air. He submitted his resignation the following week. The question that haunts investigators and visitors alike: who is this woman? The house witnessed 2 violent deaths in 1892, Abby Borden upstairs in the guest room, and Andrew Borden downstairs in the sitting room. Many sensitives report feeling Abby's presence, describing her energy as sad and confused, still seeking help that will never come. But this other presence, this figure on the stairs, this force that moves the dress form and appears in photographs, carries an entirely different quality. Psychic investigators who've spent time in the house describe this presence as aggressive, defensive, territorial. Where Abby's energy withdraws and hides, this entity advances and confronts. It doesn't flee from the living, but rather challenges them, watches them, follows them through the rooms. The anger some sensitives detect isn't the hot rage of violence, but something colder, more calculated. The fury of someone who believes they've been profoundly wronged and refuses to be forgotten. The theory that emerges from these encounters suggests this presence isn't Abby at all. The timeline fits Lizzie. She died in 1927 at the age of 66, spending her final decades in a larger house across town, never returning to the scene of the murders that defined her existence. She was acquitted of the crimes, freed by a jury that couldn't reconcile the evidence with their assumptions about proper Victorian womanhood. But acquittal isn't the same as innocence, and public opinion never fully exonerated her. She lived under the shadow of suspicion, avoided by former friends, the subject of whispered speculation and cruel children's rhymes. If Lizzie's spirit returned anywhere, wouldn't it be to this house, the place where everything changed? The dress form in her bedroom rotates to face visitors, as though assessing them, judging whether they believe her innocent or guilty. The shadow figure descends the stairs she walked that morning, retracing steps taken in the moments before or after 2 brutal murders. The apparition Marcus Thompson encountered moved with purpose and awareness, not the confused repetition of a residual haunting, but the deliberate actions of an intelligent presence. The aggressive, defensive energy makes psychological sense if this is indeed Lizzie. She spent 35 years after the trial defending herself against accusation and doubt, maintaining her innocence while newspapers and neighbors dissected every aspect of her character and conduct. That kind of sustained assault hardens a person, builds walls of anger and resentment that might not dissolve even in death. If some part of her consciousness remains tied to this house, would it be the quiet girl who attended church and taught Sunday school, or the hardened woman who learned to live with being forever suspected, forever judged? Visitors who encounter the phenomena in Lizzie's bedroom often report feeling watched, assessed, measured against some invisible standard. The dress form turns, and something in that eyeless rotation suggests scrutiny. Shadow figures appear in photographs, always a woman's shape, always in Victorian dress, and the mind inevitably supplies the question, is that her? Is Lizzie Borden still here, still defending her territory, still refusing to be driven away by scandal or accusation, or the simple passage of time? The house holds its secrets close, offering glimpses, but never full revelation. The dress form continues its rotations. Cameras capture silhouettes in doorways. Night workers encounter figures on the stairs. And somewhere in the intersection of history and haunting, a presence moves through these rooms, angry and defensive, eternally bound to the place where her life divided into before and after, innocence and suspicion. The girl she was and the infamous woman she became. The sitting room on the first floor of the Borden house has become something of a pilgrimage site for those who seek proof that violent death leaves more than bloodstains behind. It was here, on a sweltering August morning in 1892, that Andrew Jackson Borden reclined on the sofa for what would be his final rest. The attack came swiftly, brutally, and with such savage force that his face became nearly unrecognizable. 11 blows from a hatchet. 11 distinct moments of rage that transformed a human face into something else entirely. And according to dozens of witnesses who have visited this house in the decades since it became a museum and bed and breakfast, something of that violence remains trapped within these walls, replaying itself for those unfortunate or curious enough to witness it. The room itself appears deceptively peaceful during daylight hours. The horsehair sofa where Andrew died has been positioned against the wall beneath a large mirror, recreating the scene as it existed on that terrible morning. The wallpaper is period-appropriate, patterned with small flowers. A clock sits on the mantel. Lace curtains filter the afternoon sun. Tour guides bring groups through this space multiple times each day, recounting the known facts of the murder. Most visitors listen, take photographs, and move along to the next room. But some visitors, those who linger a moment too long, or who arrive when the light hits the room at particular angles, experience something that no historical account can quite explain. Martha Hendricks was among the first to report the phenomenon of the phantom impression. She visited the house in late September of 2003, part of a Halloween season tour group that included 15 other people. The guide had just finished describing how Andrew's body had been positioned on the sofa when Martha, standing at the back of the group, noticed something odd. The sofa cushions, which had appeared flat and undisturbed moments before, now bore a distinct depression. Not the kind of slight indentation you might expect from age or gravity, but the clear, defined impression of a human body. She could see where the head would have rested, where the torso would have lain, where the legs would have stretched out. The fabric appeared compressed, weighted down by invisible mass. Martha assumed someone from the earlier tour group must have sat on the sofa, though signs throughout the house strictly prohibit touching the furniture. She raised her hand to ask the guide about it, but when she glanced back at the sofa to point out what she meant, the impression was gone. The cushions were flat again, smooth and undisturbed. She felt a cold sensation wash over her arms despite the warmth of the late summer day. Later, she would tell a local paranormal investigator that she had the distinct feeling she was not meant to see what she had seen, that she had glimpsed something that existed between moments. A residual echo of Andrew Borden's final position replaying itself on an endless loop. Her account might have remained a single odd occurrence, easily dismissed as trick of light or imagination, except that Martha was far from alone. Over the next several years, at least 30 other visitors would report the identical phenomenon. They would enter the room, glance at the sofa, and see nothing unusual. Then something would draw their attention away, a question from the guide or movement from another tourist, and when they looked back, there it would be. The unmistakable shape of a man lying on his side, head tilted at an unnatural angle, body compressed into the cushions with such force that the impression sank deep into the fabric. Some witnesses reported seeing it for several seconds. Others caught only a glimpse before it vanished. But all of them described the same position, the same terrible angle of the head, the same sense that they were looking at something that should not exist in their present moment. The Borden House staff began keeping a log of these reports in 2007 at the suggestion of a paranormal research team that had been granted permission to investigate the property. The log fills 3 notebooks now, page after page of witness statements describing not just the phantom impression, but a cascade of other phenomena centered specifically around that sofa and the few feet of floor space in front of it. The photographs are perhaps the most disturbing evidence. Digital cameras, film cameras, phone cameras, they have all captured images that their owners insist were not visible when they pressed the shutter. The mirror above the sofa appears again and again in these photographs, reflecting not just the room, but something else. Something that should not be there. Visitors who review their photos later, back home or in their hotel rooms, zoom in on the mirror and find themselves staring at what appears to be a man's face. But this is not a normal face looking back at them. This is a face transformed by violence. Deep gashes cross the forehead and cheeks. One eye socket appears caved in, distorted beyond recognition. The mouth hangs open in what might be a scream, or might simply be the slack jaw of death. Blood appears to streak down from the wounds, dark and viscous in the photographic rendering. Jennifer and Marcus Klein, a couple from Rhode Island, who spent the night at the Borden House in October of 2015, captured one of the clearest images. They had photographed the sitting room multiple times throughout their stay, fascinated by the history and eager to document every detail. In the photos they took during the afternoon tour, the mirror reflected only the room itself, exactly as expected. But in a photo Jennifer took at approximately 11:30 that night, after most of the other guests had retired to their rooms, the mirror told a different story. There, in the reflective glass, a face emerged from the shadows behind where she stood. Marcus, reviewing the photo on the camera's small screen, felt his stomach lurch. The face was positioned exactly where Andrew's head would have rested on the sofa, but tilted up toward the mirror as if trying to see itself, trying to understand what had been done to it. The wounds were clearly visible, deep and terrible, rendering the features nearly inhuman. Jennifer deleted the photo immediately, her hands shaking, but the image remained burned into both their memories. They checked out early the next morning, unable to spend another night in the house. The museum now includes a disclaimer in its waiver form, a carefully worded paragraph that acknowledges some guests have reported unusual experiences, and that the management cannot be held responsible for emotional distress resulting from such encounters. It is as close as they can come to admitting that something genuinely strange occurs in that sitting room. The paranormal research team that investigated the house in 2009, a group called New England Afterlife Research, documented perhaps the most scientifically rigorous evidence of the phenomenon. They set up equipment throughout the house, but concentrated their monitoring devices in the sitting room. Temperature sensors, electromagnetic field detectors, infrared cameras, digital voice recorders, and full-spectrum video cameras ran continuously for 72 hours. For the first day and a half, they recorded nothing unusual. Standard temperature fluctuations, normal electromagnetic readings, no anomalies. Then, at 2:17 in the morning, on the second night, every sensor in the sitting room began registering dramatic changes simultaneously. The temperature, which had been holding steady at 68 degrees Fahrenheit, plummeted to 38 degrees in less than 90 seconds. The temperature drop was localized entirely to a space roughly 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, the exact dimensions of the sofa. The rest of the sitting room remained at 68 degrees. The adjoining dining room registered 67 degrees, but that one specific spot, where Andrew had died, became cold enough that the investigators watching the monitors could see their breath when they rushed into the room to document what was happening. The cold lasted for approximately 7 minutes. During that time, the electromagnetic field detectors registered spikes that jumped erratically between baseline and levels 3 times normal. The infrared cameras captured what appeared to be a heat signature on the sofa. a body-shaped area that glowed with residual warmth against the freezing air around it, as if something was lying there generating heat while simultaneously draining heat from the surrounding atmosphere. When the temperature finally began to rise again, it did so gradually, taking nearly 20 minutes to return to normal. The lead investigator, a former physicist named Dr. Raymond Cross, stated in his published report that he could find no natural explanation for the localized temperature drop or the contradictory thermal readings. But even more unsettling than the documented temperature anomaly were the psychological effects reported by those who have spent time in the sitting room during these episodes. Multiple witnesses describe a sensation that goes beyond mere cold or visual phenomena. They speak of a smell, faint but unmistakable, that fills the room. Old blood? Not the sharp copper scent of fresh blood, but something darker, older, corrupted. The smell of blood that has soaked into fabric and wood and been left to decay in summer heat. Several visitors have become physically ill, rushing from the room with hands clamped over their mouths. One woman vomited in the hallway outside, unable to control her body's reaction to the phantom odor. And then there is the rage. This is perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the phenomena, because it does not come from outside the witnesses, but seems to well up from within them. People who describe themselves as generally calm and even-tempered report being overwhelmed by sudden, inexplicable anger while standing near the sofa. The feeling comes without warning and without rational cause. It is not directed at anything or anyone specific, but exists as a pure, distilled fury that floods through their bodies and makes their hands clench into fists. Some have had the terrible urge to strike the person standing nearest to them. Others have felt compelled to overturn furniture or smash the mirror. The rage lasts only seconds or perhaps a minute, and when it passes, it leaves the witnesses shaken and disturbed by their own capacity for violence. Dr. Claire Westwood, a psychologist who specializes in trauma theory, visited the house in 2012 specifically to investigate these reports. She experienced the rage phenomenon herself, describing it later as the most frightening moment of her professional career. Standing alone in the sitting room during an early morning investigation, she felt what she described as an invasion of her consciousness. The anger that flooded through her felt foreign, as if it belonged to someone else but was using her body as a vessel. She had the distinct impression of a male presence, something so consumed with fury that it could not rest, could not dissipate, could only replay that rage endlessly in the space where it had last been felt in life. Her theory, presented in a paper published in the Journal of Anomalous Psychology, suggests that extreme trauma can create what she calls an environmental imprint. The violence of Andrew Borden's death, the sudden transformation from peaceful sleep to brutal murder, may have been so psychologically and physically overwhelming that it left a kind of energetic scar on the location. Not a conscious ghost or spirit in the traditional sense, but a recording of sorts, a fragment of traumatic experience that becomes embedded in the physical space and replays under certain conditions. The rage that witnesses feel, she argues, may be Andrew's own rage, the fury of a man being murdered in his own home, betrayed and destroyed while in a state of complete vulnerability. Other researchers have expanded on this theory, noting that the sitting room experiences seem to intensify during late summer, particularly in August as the anniversary of the murders approaches. They point to the cyclical nature of the phenomena, the way it seems to build and fade according to some internal rhythm that may correspond to the original event. If trauma can indeed stain a space, they argue, then perhaps that stain grows more vivid when temporal conditions align with the moment of its creation. Whatever the explanation, whether psychological, paranormal, or some combination of both, the sitting room continues to affect visitors in ways that defy easy categorization. The phantom impression on the sofa, the mutilated face in the mirror, the inexplicable cold, the smell of old blood, and the overwhelming rage all point to the same unsettling conclusion. Andrew Borden may have died on that August morning in 1892, but something of his final moments remains trapped in the room, endlessly repeating, endlessly present, waiting for those sensitive enough or unlucky enough to perceive it. The stairs leading to the basement of 92 2nd Street seem ordinary enough in daylight. 14 wooden steps descending into darkness, worn smooth by more than a century of footsteps. But there is something about those stairs that makes even the most seasoned paranormal investigators pause before descending, something that has led to an unspoken rule among those who study the Borden house: never go down there alone. The basement is where the handleless hatchet was found, wedged behind a timber in the corner furthest from the stairs. The weapon that may have ended 2 lives, discovered in the same space where investigators now report the most violent and terrifying encounters in the entire house. While the second-floor bedrooms carry their own weight of tragedy, and the sitting room echoes with the memory of Abby Borden's last moments, the basement holds something different. Something older. Something that doesn't just observe or replay the past, but actively interacts with the living in ways that leave physical marks and psychological scars. Those who have spent time investigating the paranormal activity at the Borden house will tell you that the atmosphere changes the moment you reach the top of those basement stairs. The temperature drops noticeably, often by 10 or 15 degrees, even in the height of summer. The air becomes thick, heavy in a way that makes breathing feel labored, and there is a feeling described consistently by dozens of visitors over the years of being absolutely unwanted. Not just unwelcome, but actively despised. Sarah Chen, a paranormal researcher with 15 years of experience investigating some of New England's most notoriously haunted locations, first visited the Borden house in 2011. She had investigated the Salem witch house, spent nights in the cells of the old Connecticut State Prison, walked the halls of countless locations associated with tragedy and death. Nothing prepared her for the basement. She was halfway down the stairs, camera in one hand and electromagnetic field detector in the other, when she felt it. 2 hands, flat and firm against her shoulder blades, shoving her forward with enough force that she lost her footing entirely. Sarah fell down the remaining 7 steps, landing hard on the basement floor, her equipment scattering across the dirt and stone. When she looked back up the stairs, gasping for breath and checking herself for injuries, there was no one there. Her 2 colleagues were still at the top of the landing, frozen in horror at what they had just witnessed. They had seen her fall, seen the way her body lurched forward as if pushed, but they had seen no one touch her. Sarah still bears a small scar on her right knee from that fall. More significantly, she still refuses to enter the basement at 92 2nd Street, even in broad daylight with a full team. When asked about that day, she describes the hands that pushed her as feeling completely solid, completely real, and completely intent on causing her harm. Her experience is far from isolated. The physical assault Sarah endured represents one point on a spectrum of basement encounters that range from unsettling to genuinely dangerous. Multiple investigators and visitors have reported being touched, grabbed, or pushed in that space. But perhaps more disturbing than the physical contact is the voice. It is always described the same way. Male-eyed, commanding, absolutely authoritative, and always delivering the same 2-word message: get out. Michael Torres heard it in 2014 while setting up audio recording equipment in the corner where the hatchet was found. He described the voice as coming from directly behind him, close enough that he could feel breath on his neck, though when he spun around, the basement was empty except for his 2 companions on the far side of the room. They heard nothing. The voice spoke only to Michael, and the command was delivered with such force, such unquestionable authority, that he found himself climbing the stairs before he consciously decided to leave. Jennifer Wu heard the same voice in 2017. She was alone in the basement for less than 90 seconds, taking baseline temperature readings, when the command came. Unlike Michael, she heard it not as a whisper near her ear, but as a shout that seemed to fill the entire space. She described it as the voice of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question, someone whose authority was absolute and unquestionable. Jennifer, who has a doctorate in parapsychology and approaches paranormal investigation with rigorous scientific skepticism, left the basement immediately and found herself shaking at the top of the stairs, unable to fully explain why a disembodied voice had generated such an overwhelming compulsion to obey. The voice is not the only auditory phenomenon in the basement. Footsteps are heard regularly when the space is empty. Heavy footsteps, consistent with a full-grown man pacing back and forth in the area where the hatchet was found. Whispers in corners where no one stands. And occasionally, a sound that multiple witnesses have described as weeping, soft and feminine, and heartbreaking in its despair. But the basement seems to save its cruelest tricks for electronic equipment. Every investigation team that has attempted to document the basement has experienced the same frustrating and inexplicable pattern. Their equipment fails. Not gradually, not through normal battery depletion, but instantly and completely. Fresh batteries drain to zero within minutes. Digital recorders stop functioning despite showing full power. Cameras shut down, their electronics scrambled in ways that sometimes render them permanently damaged. Electromagnetic field detectors spike to maximum readings and then die completely. A team from the Atlantic Paranormal Society brought over $5,000 worth of equipment into the basement in 2016. Within 30 minutes, every single piece had malfunctioned. Cameras that had worked perfectly moments before refused to power on. Audio recorders produced nothing but static. Even simple analog thermometers gave wildly fluctuating readings that made no physical sense. One investigator's watch, a mechanical timepiece that required no battery, stopped entirely and never ran again despite multiple attempts at repair. The pattern is so consistent that some researchers have developed a theory. Whatever inhabits the basement doesn't want to be documented. It doesn't want proof of its existence captured and taken out into the world. It wants to remain in shadow, to operate in darkness, to keep its nature hidden from scrutiny. The case of Rebecca Marsh stands as perhaps the most disturbing incident in the basement's documented history. Rebecca was an overnight guest at the house in 2018, part of a small group that had paid for the privilege of spending the night in one of America's most infamous murder sites. Around 2 in the morning, unable to sleep, she told her roommate she was going downstairs for some water. Security cameras in the first floor hallway show her opening the basement door and descending the stairs at 2:13 in the morning. At 2:33, 20 minutes later, Rebecca was found at the top of the basement stairs by another guest who heard strange sounds coming from the stairwell. She was sitting with her back against the wall, her eyes open but unfocused, her breathing rapid and shallow. When the other guest asked if she was all right, Rebecca didn't respond. She seemed to be awake, but completely unaware of her surroundings, staring at nothing with an expression that the witness described as absolute terror frozen on her face. It took several minutes to get Rebecca to respond to questions, and when she finally did, she had no memory of the past 20 minutes. She remembered opening the basement door. She remembered the first few steps down into the darkness, and then nothing until she found herself at the top of the stairs, with people asking if she needed help. The missing 20 minutes were simply gone, erased from her memory as if they had never happened. But something had happened in that basement. Rebecca's arms, from wrist to elbow, were covered in bruises, dark, distinctive bruises that formed clear and unmistakable patterns. The patterns of fingerprints. Large fingerprints, consistent with a fully grown man's hands, circling both of her forearms as if someone had grabbed her and held on tight enough to leave marks that would last for weeks. Medical examination confirmed that the bruises were fresh, sustained within the time frame of her missing 20 minutes. The placement and pressure patterns were consistent with restraint, with someone gripping her arms to hold her still or prevent her from leaving. But Rebecca was alone in the basement. The security footage showed her descending alone, and no one else entering or exiting the basement during that 20-minute window. Whatever left those fingerprint bruises on her arms wasn't captured by any camera. Rebecca left the house the next morning and has refused all interviews about her experience. The photographs of her bruised arms, however, have been analyzed by multiple experts, all of whom confirm the same thing. Those are grip marks, applied with significant force by someone with large hands. Someone who held her tight enough to hurt, tight enough to leave evidence that lasted for weeks after the encounter. The thermal imaging footage from 2019 adds another layer to the basement's mysteries. A team of investigators using state-of-the-art thermal cameras captured something that has never been adequately explained. The footage shows the basement in false color, heat signatures appearing as bright shapes against the cooler background. 3 investigators appear as expected, their body heat registering clearly. But in the corner where the hatchet was found, there is a 4th heat signature, human shape, standing upright, radiating warmth, consistent with a living person despite the fact that the corner was empty. All 3 investigators in the basement confirmed that no one was standing in that corner. The thermal camera showed otherwise. The heat signature remained visible for nearly 4 minutes, standing motionless in the corner before simply fading away, the temperature gradually dropping until the corner registered the same coolness as the rest of the basement. frame-by-frame analysis of the footage shows details that make the phenomenon even more unsettling. The heat signature has definition, variation in temperature that suggests the structure of a human body, warmer at the core, slightly cooler at the extremities, exactly as a living person would appear on thermal imaging. Some researchers dismiss the footage as equipment malfunction, though the camera in question has been tested extensively and has never produced similar anomalies before or since. Others suggest environmental factors, perhaps heat rising from the floor or reflecting from the walls. But those familiar with thermal imaging technology find these explanations insufficient. The signature is too clearly defined, too obviously humanoid in shape, too consistent with the appearance of an actual person to be easily dismissed as error or environmental artifact. Which brings us to the darkest theory about the basement of 92 2nd Street. A theory that attempts to explain why this particular space generates such intense and violent activity. Why the phenomena here feel different from the rest of the house. Why the presence in the basement seems older somehow, more primal, more purely malevolent than the echoes of Andrew and Abby Borden could account. What if something was in that basement before the murders? What if something had been there for years, perhaps decades, perhaps even longer? The house was built in 1845, constructed on land that had been part of Fall River for generations before that. What happened on that land before the house was built? What might have happened in that basement in the years between 1845 and that August morning in 1892, when 2 people were murdered just floors above? Some researchers have begun exploring the possibility that the murders themselves were influenced by whatever dwells in the basement. That Lizzie Borden, if she was indeed the killer, might not have acted entirely of her own volition. That the rage required to strike her father and stepmother over and over and over again might have been amplified or even inspired by something that whispered to her from below, something that fed on anger and violence and wanted more. This theory remains deeply controversial and unproven, existing more in the realm of speculation than serious historical inquiry. But those who have experienced the basement firsthand, who have felt the malevolence that emanates from that space, who have been touched and pushed and commanded to leave by something that doesn't show itself on camera, find the theory less far-fetched than it might initially seem. Because whatever is in that basement doesn't feel like the ghost of a murder victim. It doesn't carry the confused, tragic energy of souls cut down before their time. It feels ancient, purposeful, aware, and deeply, fundamentally hostile to the living who dare to enter its domain. The basement keeps its secrets, hidden in shadow, waiting in the corner where a handleless hatchet once rested, ready for hands that history may never fully understand. The Lizzie Borden Bed and Breakfast Museum opens its doors to guests every single day of the year. People from around the world book rooms months in advance, eager to spend the night within these walls where Andrew and Abby Borden met their violent end. They sleep in the same rooms where the murders occurred. They sit on furniture that witnessed the bloodshed. They pay for the privilege of stepping into history's most notorious crime scene, hoping for something more than just a tour of the past. The house stands at 92 2nd Street in Fall River, Massachusetts, looking much as it did on that terrible August morning in 1892. The exterior has been carefully maintained. The interior has been restored to reflect the period. Visitors walk the same floors Lizzie walked. They climb the same narrow staircase she climbed. They stand in the same spots where her father and stepmother drew their final breaths. But something else has been preserved here too. Something that cannot be restored or maintained through careful historical accuracy. What draws people to spend the night in a house where such brutality unfolded? Is it morbid curiosity? A fascination with the macabre? Or is it something deeper? A need to confront the darkness that exists in the world, to stare into the abyss and see what stares back. Whatever the reason, they come. They sign the guest book. They choose their rooms. And they wait to see what the night will bring. The experiences vary wildly. Some guests sleep peacefully through the night, waking refreshed and perhaps slightly disappointed that nothing extraordinary occurred. They leave with photographs and souvenirs, another quirky vacation memory to share at dinner parties. But others leave changed. They check out early, unwilling to spend another moment within these walls. They speak of things that cannot be explained away by old houses settling or imagination running wild in the dark. The pattern of experiences defies easy explanation. It is not simply that some people are more susceptible to suggestion or have more active imaginations. Hardened skeptics have fled in the night. Believers in the paranormal have experienced nothing at all. Groups sleeping in the same room will have completely different experiences. One person seeing and feeling what others in the same space cannot perceive. The house seems to choose who will witness what it has to show. And then there is the matter of August 4th. Every year, as that date approaches, something shifts within the house. The staff notices it first. The atmosphere becomes heavier, more oppressive. The temperature fluctuations become more pronounced. The sounds intensify. It is as if the house itself remembers, as if time grows thin on the anniversary of the murders and the past bleeds through more easily. Guests who stay on August 4th report experiences far more intense than those on other nights. The weeping heard from Abby's room becomes unbearable. The apparitions are clearer, more solid. The feeling of being watched becomes overwhelming. Some claim to hear the fall of a body, the sickening thud of metal striking flesh and bone. Others report seeing actual blood, though when they look again, the surfaces are clean. Why does the activity intensify on this particular date? Is it simply the power of collective belief, the weight of all those who know the significance of August 4th and unconsciously create what they expect to experience? Or is something else at work, something that understands the passage of time, that marks the anniversary of its own violent end? The original question remains unanswered. We know what happened on that August morning in 1892. We have the autopsy reports, the crime scene photographs, the trial transcripts. We know where Andrew and Abby died and how many blows each received. We can trace Lizzie's movements through the house, hear her testimony in her own words. But we still do not know why. After more than a century of speculation, investigation, and debate, the fundamental question endures. What drove someone to commit such savage acts in broad daylight? What fury or desperation or madness could fuel such violence? Lizzie Borden was acquitted. She lived another 33 years in Fall River, never confessing, never explaining. She took whatever truth she knew to her grave. And if the dead know the answer, they are not telling. Or perhaps they are trying to tell us, but we lack the ability to understand their language, to interpret the phenomena we label as hauntings. For years, researchers and investigators have approached the paranormal activity at the Borden House as residual energy, a kind of psychic recording playing on an endless loop. The theory suggests that violent or emotionally charged events can somehow imprint themselves on a location, creating phenomena that replay like a tape, without consciousness or intent. It is a comforting explanation in its way. It suggests that what people experience here is merely an echo, a shadow of past events without awareness or purpose. But what if that explanation is insufficient? What if what resides in this house is not merely residual, but active? What if the presences people encounter have agency, intention, the ability to choose who sees what and when? The evidence suggests something more complex than simple replay. The activity is too responsive, too targeted. It reacts to individual guests. It intensifies on specific dates. It manifests differently depending on who is present. These are not the characteristics of a passive recording. Consider the possibility that the spirits trapped or tied to this location are aware, that they have maintained some form of consciousness beyond death, that they are not simply remnants, but active entities with their own purposes and desires. What would those purposes be? What would anchor a spirit to the site of its violent death for more than a century? Perhaps they seek recognition, acknowledgement of what was done to them. Perhaps they are trying to communicate something essential about that terrible morning, something that was never understood in life and remains misunderstood in death. Or perhaps their purposes are darker, born of rage and pain that death has not diminished. Perhaps they want others to feel what they felt, to understand through direct experience the horror of their final moments. The house staff tells stories that suggest intelligence behind the phenomena. Objects move when specific questions are asked. Activity increases when certain topics are discussed. Apparitions appear at meaningful moments, as if responding to the thoughts or words of the living. A former caretaker who worked at the museum for over 15 years observed patterns that convinced her the house itself has become something more than wood and brick. She noticed that guests who showed disrespect or made light of the murders often had the most terrifying experiences. Skeptics who came to mock often left believers. Those who approached with genuine curiosity and respect sometimes reported feeling welcomed, almost comforted by presences that seemed benign. It was as if the house, or what dwells within it, could sense intention, could distinguish between those who came to honor and those who came to ridicule. This same caretaker, who has since left her position but still speaks about her time there, offered an observation that captures something essential about the Borden house. She said that the house does not just remember what happened, it wants you to remember too. And once you have stayed here, you never really leave. Part of you remains behind, connected somehow to the events of 1892, to the terrible morning when violence shattered the quiet of 2nd Street. Guests who have stayed multiple times report that the house feels familiar, even between visits, as if they never truly left. Some dream of the house regularly, walking its halls in sleep, encountering its residents in the borderland between waking and dreaming. Others find themselves thinking of it at odd moments, the memory surfacing unbidden, insistent. It is as if the house has marked them somehow, claimed them as witnesses to its eternal tragedy. The sitting room where Andrew Borden died remains the heart of the house. The sofa where he took his final rest has been positioned according to historical photographs and accounts. Visitors can sit where he sat, though most hesitate, unnerved by the thought of occupying that specific space. The room is often empty of people, but never feels empty. The air is dense with presence, with watching, with waiting. Late at night, when the tours have ended and the guests have retired to their rooms, the sitting room waits in darkness. The sofa sits empty, its surface undisturbed. But in the morning, sometimes, there are impressions in the cushions, as if someone or something has been sitting there through the long night hours. The staff smooths the fabric, prepares the room for another day of visitors. And the cycle continues, as it has for decades, as it likely will for decades more. The house on 2nd Street stands as an eternal witness to events that unfolded in minutes, but echo through generation. It holds its secrets close, revealing them only in fragments, in fleeting visions and unexplained sounds, in feelings that grip the heart and refuse logical explanation. Those who enter seeking answers may leave with only more questions, but they will leave changed, marked by their encounter with a place where the past refuses to stay buried, where the dead may not rest, and where the truth remains just beyond reach. Tantalizingly close, but forever obscured by the shadows that gather in these rooms, waiting for the next witness to arrive. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.